So we actually went to her private home and were welcomed into her living room. And actually there it was just President Megawati herself, and then Ralph Boyce, who was at the time the ambassador from the United States to Indonesia. There was Karen Brooks, who I just mentioned about. And then there was a woman who was presented as the personal assistant to George Bush, who had come to deliver a special message. Now, by the way, this woman had told me that she was a CIA agent. Of course, this was not told to Megawati. And what happened in the meeting, basically, the envoy, the CIA agent, presented to Megawati, President Megawati, saying, look, there is this guy, Abu Bakr Bashir. We have evidence here that he tried to kill you twice, and that he was responsible for these bombings of churches in Indonesia, and we have all of this evidence. Therefore, we want you to secretly capture him. The term they used was to render him, which more and more people are learning about. And by the way, I didn't know what render was before I went into this meeting, and I was thankful that Karen Brooks pulled me aside and said, do you know what rendering is? And I said, well, yeah, to render something intelligible. She said, no, this is a special meaning. To render means to secretly capture and turn over to another country. So they asked President Megawati, would she be willing to render Abu Bakr Bashir to the United States so they could secretly take him and send him off somewhere like Guantanamo or something like that? And, they fully expected her to say yes. And interestingly enough, she took a breath and she said, I'm sorry, I can't do that. He's too well known.
Astonishingly, the Bush administration rejected Indonesia's requests for al-Farouq to give evidence at Bashir's trial. Then the most amazing thing happened.
Indonesian authorities have reacted angrily to revelations today that a leading Southeast Asian-based al-Qaeda figure has escaped from US custody. And they've criticised the Bush administration for failing to immediately notify Indonesia of the escape, saying the operative's freedom increases the threat of terrorism to the region. Omar al-Farouq, one of al-Qaeda's leading Southeast Asian operatives who forged close links with Jemaah Islamiyah in Indonesia, escaped from the United States Bagram Air Base in July this year. But the escape only became public on Tuesday after al-Farouq was called to testify at a US military tribunal. As Nick McKenzie reports, the Bush administration has now promised to investigate the failure of US officials to inform the Indonesian authorities.
Omar al-Farouq was considered one of al-Qaeda's leading operatives in Southeast Asia before his capture in Indonesia in mid-2002. Shortly after his arrest, Indonesian authorities handed him to US officials, who flew al-Farouq to Afghanistan, where he was held up until his escape from the Bagram Air Base in July this year. That handover was controversial, especially after the US refused to allow al-Farouq to return to Indonesia to testify in terrorism prosecutions, a position the US has also taken with JI figure Hambali. And now there's fresh controversy, not only about al-Farouq's escape, but the fact that the US did not tell some of its intelligence counterparts, including Indonesia, that he was on the run. Professor Zachary Abuza is an expert on Jemaah Islamiyah and terrorism at Simmons College in Boston.
They certainly should be angry at this simply because the Indonesian elite took such such criticisms at the time. Omar al-Farouq was one of the first people who was rendered to the United States under the CIA's extraordinary rendition program. And the Islamists were very unhappy that the government caved into American pressure. Remember, this was in June 2002, well before the Bali blast and before the Indonesians were on board the war on terror. And at the same time, the Indonesians are very unhappy at the United States simply because they continue to deny Indonesian officials access to Hambali, let alone transfer him to Indonesia, where he will go under Indonesian legal proceedings.
Omar al-Farouk's escape was only made public after he was called to testify at a military tribunal on Tuesday, a couple of months after his escape.
So how does Al-Qaeda's highest-ranking operative in Southeast Asia escape from a high-security prison with 3 other inmates? The New York Times reported that the suspects are believed to have picked the lock on their cell, changed out of their bright orange uniforms, and made their way through a heavily guarded military base under the cover of night. They then crawled over a faulty wall where a getaway vehicle was apparently waiting for them. So let's get this straight. The high-security prison airbase is guarded by over 8,000 soldiers. Everyone who enters or leaves the prison must pass through its only entrance. The 4 prisoners picked their locks, changed their clothes, and hid within the prison. Once darkness set in, the 4 negotiated their way through the prison, scaling the prison barrier, crossing a road, heading through the guarded airbase, scaling another wall, negotiating through the mine-ridden fields to find a friend waiting in a getaway car. The car, filled with a driver and the 4 fugitives, bypassed block roads and checkpoints, evading the large-scale manhunt and helicopter patrols.
British troops in Iraq have killed one of Al-Qaeda's most senior operatives there. Omar al-Farouk has been described as the link between Osama bin Laden's terrorist organisation and Jamaah Islamiyah, the group responsible for the Bali bombings of 2002 and 2005. Farouk was captured in Indonesia in 2002, but then embarrassed the US when he escaped from their prison at Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan last year. He was tracked to the Iraqi city of Basra and shot dead in a pre-dawn raid by about 200 British troops.